To borrow a celestial quote from John Green's character in The Fault in Our Stars, some infinities are bigger than others, and that entirely applies to Dune Part 2, because, as I said about the first part, or the first film, that film was, and it still is in my view, a masterpiece. Yet, Dune Part 2 is a bigger masterpiece. It builds upon the work of the first film, it has more character moments, the world building is more expansive, the themes are expanded and developed further, everything is bigger, better, in my view, for this film. However, you've got to contextualise it, because you can't have this Part 2 without a fantastic Part 1. And Denis Villeneuve talked about that in the run-up to this film, that this isn't a sequel, it's a Part 2 of the Dune franchise, which soon will be, and has been, greenlit to be a trilogy. And I think that is important when you come into this film, because I came into this film completely blind, other than seeing the first film, again, to get myself ready for this one. But other than that, nothing else. I've not read any of the original books, I've not read about any of the spoilers and things. And when the film ended, I was like, oh! And that was it. I was like, that's it. Well, there's all these other things, and I quickly realised that there's going to be another one, and I was totally happy in that. So, what is the plot of Dune Part 2? So, hopefully you've seen Dune Part 1 if you're watching this video review, but Dune Part 2 picks up directly after Part 1. You've got Paul Atreides and her mother, Lady Jessica, in the Dune, essentially, the deserts of Arrakis, with the Fremen people, including Chani and Stilgar, and they're hiding from the Harkonnens who are chasing them down. And it goes on from there. I'm very cautious to kind of tell you what happens in the film, because so much happens in the, almost 3-hour run time, that to give any more than that would really be taking, the joy away from you to see where this film goes. But what I will say is this, that my viewing experience of Dune Part 2, because I saw it twice, because there's this idea with films or with any kind of, media, story, narrative-based media, that you have to watch it twice, at least the good stuff twice, to really start to get to the heart of the piece. And this is definitely true for Dune Part 2, because when I first watched Dune Part 2, I was a bit like the Southern tribe of the Fremen. I was completely in awe of the spectacle of it. Everything that I complimented Part 1 about, Vermette's production design, the attention to detail from Villeneuve, how he uses witnesses of characters, which he does a lot more in this, characters as witness to events, the contrasting ideas and presentation styles and mise-en-scène for the Harkonnen and the, Atreides family versus the Fremen, shooting on location, all these things that can go on and on and on. Just watch that review. It's here as well. But because of all that, I was so swept up in it. I believed in this idea that Paul Atreides is the Lisan al-Gaib, and that he is the one to, as he says in this film, lead the Fremen to paradise. But upon second viewing, I started seeing things a bit different. I was also more closer to a Bene Gesserit, just bear with me with this metaphor, because I knew what was going to happen. I could essentially predict the future of this world that was being presented on screen, because I'd been here before, I'd seen it. And so I was watching the film in that way, but still very much enjoying it and noticing details and things that I didn't in the first viewing. And then it hit me by the end of watching it a second time, Part 2. I realised that actually I had a much more sceptical view of the events that go on within the film. Not the quality of the film, but the events that go on in the film. And my reading of Dune Part 2 afterwards wasn't that Paul Atreides was a hero, but actually closer to what Villeneuve has quoted Herbert of saying, is that this book is a bit of a warning, an allegorical warning about the dangers of putting people on pedestals, of creating icons or creating prophets, both religious or otherwise, and the danger in that. And you see, because of the events of the film, and upon second viewing, I realised, fuck me, this is hegemony in action. This is not a hero conquering a villain. This is a transformation going on, and just a shifting, if you're going to be really pessimistic, a shifting of the pieces. Paul's character has a massive transformation throughout this film. Upon first viewing, I thought he was a hero, but upon second viewing, having known the events like a Bene Gesserit. But then I came out of the film at the end feeling more like Charney, completely disillusioned with Paul and the actual ideas that he's and values that he's purporting to have, and which he does actually seem to operate by for a good half, if not 2/3 of the film. But then something changes, and I'll let you, the viewer, the audience member, the engaged person sitting across behind the camera, understand. Because once that changes, this thing happens. Paul's whole outlook of being anti-colonialist or imperialist completely changes. And once I'd seen that, I couldn't unsee it, and it made me view the events of the film at the end, which other critics have criticised as being a bit rushed. I don't see it as that. I think it was the perfect ending because, you know, it's a part 2 of a 3-parter of a trilogy, because Villeneuve is going to adapt Dune Messiah, which is the sequel, and so I didn't mind the ending where it ended, because where it ended, I thought, oh my god, you know, it's just a shifting of the chess pieces. The war is just perpetuating, and it's growing larger, it's going on a bigger scale. You know, it's not ended, it's just growing bigger, which is actually really sad, even though the masterful filmmaking, and because, you know, you get so enraptured with these characters and the stories because it's so well done. You think, oh my god, it's epic, it's cool, it's this, it's a visual spectacle, it's great storytelling, blah, 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 blah. Actually, it's really sad. It's really sad, because what you're seeing is, and it happens in the film, is the prediction of millions and billions of fictional lives being lost. And it's sad to see that the hero, under his own hubris and under his own folly, in this kind of, you know, Roman or Greek tragic manner, is actually, or even like Macbeth, is the more that he's trying to struggle and avoid his own fate, the more he's sealing it. And I thought that is fantastic. Now, Sam, get off your high horse. Stop talking the meta-narrative. Talk about specifics. What was great about this film? And there's a lot to say that was fantastic about this film. First of all, people keep talking about it a lot, but Austin Butler's addition to the film as Feyd-Rautha, I thought he was fantastic. Villeneuve and Fraser, the cinematographer, goes even further by when Feyd-Rautha is fighting in the Colosseum, they shoot it, if I'm not mistaken, it'll be infrared or it might be gamma. Sorry, I can't remember. But they shoot using this different light because the way that the Colosseum's created is that they've got this kind of like dome bubble around them, and so everything's in this black and white, but you can see people's veins and things. And what it does is, it's not just gimmicky, it's a good way, because it's a long film and a lot of the film takes place upon Arrakis. It's a nice little breather, a visual respite from the orange and browns of Arrakis to this really matte black look that you have in the Colosseum fight. And it's a great introduction into Feyd-Rautha's character, because he's not just like villainous. When the fight's happening, without spoiling it, he fights in gladiatorial fashion against 3 different Atreides family associates, and things have been done to them with their poor treatment and have them been kept, that means that Feyd-Rautha's a shoo-in to win. And he's also got one of those basically shields on that protects him from being hurt unless you stab and you hold the knife close to him, then it phases through and you can kill the person. 2 of the 3 people that he's fighting against have been incapacitated in some way, but the 3rd one hasn't, and that's part of Baron Harkonnen's plan. What he does is, he takes his shield off and he fights this guy 1-to-1, evenly matched, so he could effectively die, and there's these really creepy kind of like black court jester people around him to make sure that the fight doesn't end with Feyd-Rautha dying, and they try and get involved because, you know, this Atreides combatant's getting the upper hand, and they dig these poles with spikes in to like pull them back and yank, and he like shouts out, he goes, no! Because he wants the honour of the fight. He wants it to be an even playing field, but he's a narcissist, and he's evil, and he's all these other things, but there's an honour in it. And anyway, there's a fight, and one of the lines he says in it is, you fought well, Atreides, and that comes around at the end of the film. So there's this cyclical narrative that Feyd-Rautha has, which I think is just a really very streamlined but effective way at telling a story, because there's lots going on in this film. Okay, there's lots going on, a lot of plates spinning, and I think it does it really, 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 really well. Now, with Feyd-Rautha being the new antagonist, there's this nice kind of interplay between, that you can do analysis-wise between Paul Atreides' character and Fade Routher's character. They're both different in the sense that they're on different sides of the war. One's the Harkonnens, one's the Atreides, but the lines start to get blurred throughout the film, which I won't spoil. Their morals are different. One's a ruthless killer, but the other one's trying to do something to protect the other people. One wants power, the other. But then again, those kind of motivations and the actuality of the events that are happening in the films actually start to blur once again. And so, in my opinion, this is less of a review and almost just an analysis at this point, that these characters are much more similar than they probably seem to be upon first viewing, and it's really exciting to see that happen. I'm holding my phone like this because I live at home and people are in the chat. So there's been this Cosmopolitan article, which I know is the bastion of film critique, but it was criticising the fact that basically there's erasure going on of Muslim, Middle Eastern, North African characters or actors, seeing as there's only one, which is Charlie's friend in the film, who's acts as a witness to a lot that's going on, which Villeneuve talks about in his interviews that he's been doing, and that he likes kind of a witness to the events that's going on because he finds that interesting, and it's someone for the audience can kind of relate with, and also we get a different perspective as well in terms of Paul's assimilation into the Fremen, and the tension between someone who may be infiltrating or not into an indigenous group. But basically, this Cosmopolitan article is titled "How Dune Part 2 Erases Middle Eastern, North African and Muslim Influences." It says what it does on the tin. Now, I'm not completely disregarding this view, because I agree it is annoying if you're a person of minority to then see your heritage and your cultures, which have so often been demonised, now being put into one of the biggest films of modern times potentially, people loving it and wanting to emulate the style and things like that. It will be annoying if you've suffered racial or religious abuse, right? So I understand it. However, I'm seeing it from the filmmaker's perspective. Something else that they talk about also in the review is that in the original book they use the term, Herbert does use the term jihad, which means to struggle, but obviously we're living in 2024 now, and not when that term had that meaning. It now has a much more darker meaning. So, seeing it from the filmmaker's perspective, I do understand the decision for one, not using the term jihad, because obviously it has a new negative meaning. But also, John Spate's logic is, which I'm going to quote, is that talking about turning away from Arab influences, he says that the Arab world is much more exotic in the 1960s than it is today, but today the Arab world is much more with us. There are fellow Americans, they're everywhere, and what you can really see in Frank Herbert's worldview is him just dipping the toe into Islam and the Arab world, and that was sufficiently exotic enough for science fiction. Now you have to go much further afield to make this sci-fi. That's his kind of message. But I think the more kind of pertinent and interesting point is that Herbert's message of Dune, i.e. believing in messiahs or prophets and the dangers that come with that, if you started to present this as a commentary upon Islam or North Africa or Middle East in general, you could argue that that itself is an Orientalist perspective. What do you mean all Muslim people believe in Allah and therefore they're all fucking radicals? Do you know what I mean? Like that's you can't divorce that critique of erasure from the meta-narrative of the film, and that's what annoyed Herbert and Villeneuve most about the original books and the reception of them. And that's why Herbert wrote Messiah, and that's probably why Villeneuve is gonna direct Messiah, obviously to complete the trilogy as well. So I don't totally disregard that point. Could they have included more North African, Middle Eastern, Muslim actors? Of course they can. But to push it or put it more in your face that is in danger of potentially conflating, the meta-narrative of the piece, or the real message, right, and Islam, right? And plus jihad, it means a different thing now. So I understand, risk-averse conglomerates and companies and Hollywood not wanting to include that, right? But it would have been kind of exciting if Dune reclaimed that term from, the terrorist kind of connotations that it has now into something much more innocuous, like the original term. I've mentioned it briefly, but other reviews have said about that the ending is too rushed. So there's a massive kind of dramatic fight that happens, and I won't say war with what regards to the context of it, but it happens and it's fantastic. And once this fight kicks in, the film doesn't slow down. Now, people have said that, oh, it could leave people behind. That's what the Empire Review said. Bradshaw said in The Guardian that we've spent, 330 minutes, if you include both the films together. We should deserve an ending now. But he does admit that this might be kind of his own hubris at play. But really, I just think you're cutting your nose off to spite your face, because I just keep coming back to it. This is part 2 of a 3-part. It's not a sequel, right? It's a beginning, a middle and an end, hopefully, with the third film being the end. Each film, whilst it has obviously its own beginning, middle and end, it's more about the holistic piece together as a 3-part, 3-film piece. Like, people will call it a trilogy, but it's kind of one big, like, probably 9-hour-long film split in 3. But again, that doesn't do it justice for how well it's structured and the storytelling within it. I disregard kind of those things. They didn't bother me. And again, I went in thinking that it was going to be the end, and it wasn't. And I was so happy it wasn't the end, because whilst it did open more doors and more questions, that need answering in Dune Messiah or Dune Part 3, it doesn't, because it was so well done. So I put them to the side as well. I think, in conclusion, what we have on our hands here is a repeat of history with what Peter Jackson did with Lord of the Rings. When Lord of the Rings Return of the King came out, it won every Oscar that year. 11 Oscars, clean sweep. And what that film signified, because again, those trilogy of films, people struggle, Lord of the Rings fans struggle now. I've got friends that struggle and debate now which is the best film. Is it Fellowship of the Ring, the Two Towers, or Return of the King? Well, the first one's the best because it starts it all off, but no, the middle's got the most tension. But yeah, but in Return of the King it all comes and concludes. And I think a lot of the criticisms that we have will dissipate once the third film comes out, because you've got to see everything in context. And when the third film comes out, we will post-rationalise our own critiques and even the things we like about the first and the second film once that third one comes out. But until then, as I said at the start, referencing John Green, you've got infinities in infinities here. I thought part 1 was a masterpiece, and I think part 2 is an even bigger masterpiece. So I can't wait to see what part 3 has to offer. I implore you to go and see it in cinema whilst you still can. If it's still out there, go and see it on the biggest screen possible, because if you don't, you will completely regret it, and it will be one of the best film decisions you make in 2024. Dune Part 2 is a masterpiece.